Well, I hate to say it, but if you are already struggling because of the prices of food, gas, housing, insurance, furniture, clothing, and so much more, well, this video probably isn't going to make you any happier. I wish I had better news for you. I really do. But unfortunately, the reality of what we're facing right now is pretty concerning. And I think you need to understand what's happening because it's going to affect your wallet, your budget, your daily life in very real ways. Because what we are now hearing is that President Trump is adamant about pushing for additional tariffs. And when I say adamant, I mean he's really digging in on this. He said this just yesterday in a press conference, and he addressed two different reasons why he is going to push for additional tariffs. Two separate justifications for why we're going to see more costs added to imported goods, which ultimately means higher prices for consumers. This is going to hurt millions of Americans. I don't say that lightly. I'm not being dramatic. I'm not exaggerating. This is going to have a real impact on real people's budgets. And according to businesses, according to companies that import goods, according to retailers, they can't wait any longer and are now having to push the price increases over to the end consumer. That's you and I. They've been absorbing some of these costs. They've been eating some of these tariff expenses, but they can't do it anymore. Their margins are getting squeezed too much. So now they're passing those costs along, which means when you go to the grocery store, when you go to the gas station, when you shop for clothes or furniture or electronics, you're going to see higher prices. But look at this right here. Let me show you what's happening. It says Trump will impose 10% tariff if Supreme Court strikes down his deal. So here's the situation. What we know is that President Trump has imposed what he's calling his IEEPA tariffs. IEEPA stands for the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It's a law that gives the president broad authority to regulate commerce in response to national emergencies. These tariffs are anywhere from 15% to 10% to 30%. They're just a range of different tariffs on different countries. China got hit with one percentage. Mexico got hit with another percentage. Canada got different tariffs. The European Union got different tariffs. It's a whole complex web of different tariff rates on different countries for different products. But what we have now learned, and this is really important, is that the Supreme Court is somewhat skeptical as to whether or not this is legitimate. There's a case working its way through the courts challenging the president's authority to impose these tariffs under IEEPA. The argument is that IEEPA was meant for genuine national emergencies like war or terrorism, not for trade policy. And the Supreme Court is hearing arguments, and based on what we're hearing from inside the courtroom, based on the questions the justices are asking, they seem skeptical. And they may tell President Trump that you have to do away with these IEEPA tariffs. They might rule that he doesn't have the authority under that particular law to impose these tariffs. If they do that, if the Supreme Court rules against him, President Trump already has a plan. He's not just going to accept defeat and remove all the tariffs. No, he's got a backup plan already in place. Look at this right here. It says the Supreme Court is deliberating on the legality of Trump's sweeping tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, including his tariffs imposed on China, Mexico, and Canada, and his separate Liberation Day tariffs on nearly all other nations. Liberation Day was a term he used for a day when he imposed a whole bunch of tariffs all at once on dozens of countries. Okay. It says if the court rules those tariffs are invalid, the White House has a backup plan that's really solid. And when they say really solid, they mean legally defensible. They mean a plan that can't be challenged in court. The same way, President Trump would impose 10% tariffs to make up most of the revenue from the IEEPA tariffs. So even if he loses this case, even if the Supreme Court says you can't use IEEPA to impose tariffs, he's just going to turn around and impose different tariffs using different legal authority. And they would do that likely under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allows the president to impose tariffs of up to 15% for up to 150 days to resolve trade imbalances. Okay, that's the first one. So think about what this means. The Supreme Court might rule against him, but it doesn't matter because he's just going to impose tariffs anyway using a different law. So even if the Supreme Court rules against the IEEPA tariffs, President Trump will just go right back, impose a 10% tariff on those nations, and we will just do that for the next 150 days until they figure something else out. And after 150 days, they'll probably find yet another legal justification to extend them or replace them with something else. So that should scare you a little bit, or at least concern you, because according to reports, we may see more countries added to this list at the 10% mark in order to make up the revenue loss from the IEEPA tariffs. Because here's the thing. The administration has built a lot of their budget assumptions around tariff revenue. They're counting on billions and billions of dollars coming in from these tariffs. So if the Supreme Court invalidates some of those tariffs, they need to replace that revenue somehow. And the way they're going to do it is by imposing new tariffs, maybe on countries that weren't being tariffed before, or higher rates on countries that already have tariffs. Okay, now that's only the first one. That's the first reason we might see additional tariffs. Here's the other problem. There is something even bigger happening right now that is going to trump what's going on with these tariffs. And no, I didn't mean to do that as a pun, but I guess it works. There's something even more significant driving tariff policy right now. Look at this. It says Trump says he may punish countries with tariffs if they don't back the U.S. controlling Greenland. Now, you might be thinking, wait, what? Greenland? What does Greenland have to do with tariffs? What does Greenland have to do with my grocery bill? Well, let me explain, because this is actually a really big deal geopolitically, and it's driving a lot of what's happening with trade policy right now. President Trump is adamant that the United States has to control Greenland. This has been a recurring theme. He's talked about buying Greenland. He's talked about Greenland being strategically important. He's talked about this repeatedly. Okay, look at this right here. It says Trump floats new tariffs in push to acquire Greenland. He says President Trump said he may impose tariffs on countries if they don't go along with Greenland. We need Greenland for national security, so I may do that. Think about what that means. He's saying if other countries don't support the United States taking control of Greenland or buying Greenland, or however you want to phrase it, those countries might face tariffs as punishment. It says the comment came as the Supreme Court could soon deliver its ruling on the legality of Trump's reciprocal and fentanyl-related tariffs. So this is all happening at the same time. The Supreme Court case, the Greenland push, all of this is converging right now. Okay, so President Trump just said they're talking to NATO about Greenland. He's saying the U.S. needs Greenland for national security. He mentioned something about a big hole in national security if we don't have it. He referenced the Golden Dome, which is presumably some kind of military or defense infrastructure. The point is, he's making a national security argument for why the U.S. needs to control Greenland. But look what NATO's doing. Okay, I want to show you this. This is what happened on Thursday, just a couple days ago. It says NATO nations deploy to Greenland after tense White House talks. So while President Trump is saying we need to control Greenland, NATO countries are actually deploying troops to Greenland. I want to read the key points here. It says NATO members are deploying small numbers of troops to Greenland for a joint military exercise after a tense meeting at the White House about the island's future. So there was a meeting at the White House. Representatives from NATO countries were there. It got tense. There were disagreements about what should happen with Greenland. Says French President Emmanuel Macron referred to the exercise as Operation Arctic Endurance. So France is involved. They're calling it Operation Arctic Endurance. They're sending troops to Greenland for military exercises. It says talks between U.S., Danish, and Greenlandic officials were frank but constructive, but did not resolve the fundamental disagreement about Greenland's future. So there are talks happening. The U.S. is talking to Denmark because Greenland is currently a territory of Denmark. They're talking to Greenlandic officials because Greenland has its own government, even though it's part of Denmark. And these talks are described as frank but constructive, which in diplomatic language usually means they disagreed strongly but remained polite. The Danish foreign minister said, "What we have learned is that Greenlanders don't want to be part of the United States." Okay, so Denmark doesn't want Greenland to go to the United States and be controlled by the United States. And more importantly, the people of Greenland, the Greenlanders themselves, don't want to be part of the United States. But President Trump says this is a matter of national security. So, with that said, does it sound like President Trump is just going to kind of roll over and let this be? Does it sound like he's going to say, oh, well, I tried, but they said no, so I guess that's the end of it? No, absolutely not. If he is saying that countries are going to see an additional tariff if they don't go along with the United States plan of pretty much taking Greenland and making it part of the U.S., then we're talking about using tariffs as a weapon, as leverage, as a tool of foreign policy to pressure other countries to do what the U.S. wants. I don't know what's going to happen with Greenland. Now, that's for a different video talking about the geopolitics, the strategy, whether this makes sense from a national security standpoint, all of that. But the reason why this is important for this video, the reason why you need to care about this, even if you don't care about Greenland itself, is because millions of Americans are struggling to just pay their bills right now. They're struggling to put food on the table. They're struggling to keep the lights on. They're struggling to pay for their mortgage and their rent. They're struggling to just have health insurance. That's a big discussion right now. Health insurance costs are through the roof. Millions of people are seeing their cars repossessed because they can't make their car payments. Credit cards are being canceled because people can't make their minimum payments. That's what's happening in America right now. So all this talk of Greenland, yeah, it's important from a geopolitical standpoint. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. But what's even bigger, and for most people don't care what's going on with Greenland. Most people couldn't even point to Greenland on a map. Most people have no clue why it even matters. Or do they care? They're trying to figure out how to pay for groceries. They're trying to figure out how to fill up their gas tank. They're trying to figure out how to pay rent this month. But what they care about, what we care about, is prices. We care about the trade wars. We care about possible retaliation because of all this. And retaliation is a real concern. When the U.S. imposes tariffs on other countries, those countries often respond with their own tariffs on U.S. goods. It becomes a cycle. We tariff them, they tariff us. We tariff them more, they tariff us more. It escalates. Look what's going on in Iran. People in Iran are protesting on the streets, which the regime is killing them as a result of inflation, that people can't afford to live, people can't afford to eat. That's what's going on. The Iranian economy is in terrible shape, partly because of sanctions, partly because of economic mismanagement, partly because of corruption. But the bottom line is ordinary Iranians can't afford basic necessities, and they're taking to the streets. And the government is responding with violence. That's where it all started. Economic hardship leads to social unrest. And that's not just true in Iran. That's true everywhere. When people can't afford to eat, when people can't afford to heat their homes, when people feel like the economic system isn't working for them, they get angry. They protest. Things can spiral. Not only that, but if we see additional tariffs here in the United States, guess what's likely going to happen? There will be reciprocal tariffs from other countries. So it will not just be prices here in the United States going up. It'll be prices in other countries going up too. And guess what happens when prices in other countries start going up? Who do they blame? Was it President Trump? Well, initially, yes. Foreign governments will blame President Trump and his tariff policies. But essentially, they also blame every single American. It becomes America's fault. It becomes the fault of all of us that caused them to have higher prices. We become the bad guys in their narrative. Tariffs right now are being used as a weapon to ensure that the United States can get Greenland, or at least pressure other countries to support that goal, but also a weapon to ensure that, well, if the Supreme Court does rule against President Trump on the IEEPA tariffs, he can go right back with an additional tariff, a different tariff of 10% under a different legal authority. Keep that in mind because I know a lot of people are wondering, well, are we going to see relief? Is there going to be relief from these high prices? President Trump has been saying that, yes, relief is coming. He said prices will come down. He said pricing will be fixed. He said we are going to see additional benefits to the American people. It's coming. He's been saying this for months. But when? When is this relief coming? Based off what we've seen over the last several days and the talks of tariffs, it doesn't look like relief is coming anytime soon. In fact, it looks like the opposite might be true. And again, the Supreme Court could have a ruling on this case this coming week. We could get a decision as early as Monday or Tuesday. This is big news. This is extremely important because what we're going to experience over the next several weeks is going to dictate what our lives look like for the rest of 2026 and potentially beyond. Are we going to see additional relief? Are we going to see prices stabilize or come down? Or are we going to see more upward pressure on prices as a result of tariffs, whether it's from the Supreme Court ruling against President Trump and him imposing new tariffs to replace the old ones, or whether it's because other countries are actually not supporting President Trump in his desire to take over Greenland, and he's imposing tariffs as punishment. Either way, we're looking at more tariffs, which means higher prices. Now, let me break down what this actually means for your daily life in very specific terms, because I think it's important to understand how tariffs translate into price increases at the grocery store, at the gas pump, and everywhere else you spend money. When the U.S. imposes a tariff on imported goods, let's say a 10% tariff on products from a particular country, that tariff is essentially a tax on those imports. The company importing those goods has to pay that tax. Now, the company has a few options. They can absorb the cost and take lower profits. They can find a different supplier in a country that doesn't have tariffs, or they can pass the cost along to consumers. And guess what companies usually do? They pass the cost along, so that 10% tariff becomes a 10% price increase on the shelf at the store. Maybe not immediately, maybe not all at once, but eventually those costs get passed through to you. Let's talk about groceries specifically. A lot of the food we eat is either imported or depends on imported inputs. Coffee, mostly imported. Bananas, imported. Avocados, imported from Mexico. Even things that are grown in the U.S. often depend on imported fertilizers, imported machinery, imported packaging materials. So when tariffs go into effect, even on countries that you might not associate with food, it can affect grocery prices. A tariff on China might affect the cost of food packaging, which gets passed along in the price of the food. A tariff on Mexico affects produce prices because we import so much produce from Mexico, especially in the winter months when California isn't producing as much. Gas prices are another big one. Now, the U.S. produces a lot of oil domestically, so you might think tariffs wouldn't affect gas prices that much. But oil is a global commodity. The price is set by global markets, and tariffs can affect global oil markets in complex ways. If tariffs slow down economic activity globally, that can reduce demand for oil, which could actually lower prices. But if tariffs disrupt trade relationships and cause instability, that can increase oil prices because markets don't like uncertainty. And if specific tariffs target oil-producing countries or countries we depend on for refined petroleum products, that can directly increase gas prices. Clothing is heavily affected by tariffs because so much clothing is imported. Most of the clothes sold in the U.S. are made in China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Mexico, and other countries. A 10% tariff on clothing imports means your jeans, your shirts, your shoes, everything gets more expensive. Furniture is the same story. Most furniture sold in the U.S. is either imported or made from imported materials. Tariffs on China, which is where a lot of furniture comes from, directly translate to higher furniture prices. Electronics are massively affected. Almost all consumer electronics are made overseas, primarily in Asia. Your phone, your TV, your laptop, your tablet. All of these things will get more expensive if tariffs go into effect or increase. Cars are another big one. Even cars made in the U.S. often contain parts from other countries. A car might be assembled in Michigan, but the engine components come from Mexico. The electronics come from China. The tires come from South Korea. Tariffs on any of those countries can increase the cost of producing a car, which gets passed along in the sticker price. So when we talk about tariffs, we're not just talking about some abstract economic policy. We're talking about real impacts on your budget, on your cost of living, on your ability to afford the things you need and want. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger economic picture, because there are some economists who argue that tariffs can be good for the economy in certain situations. The argument goes like this. If we put tariffs on imported goods, that makes imported goods more expensive, which makes domestically produced goods more competitive. This encourages companies to manufacture things in the U.S. instead of overseas, which creates jobs in the U.S., which is good for American workers. That's the theory, and there's some truth to it in certain circumstances, but the reality is more complicated. In the short term, tariffs almost always increase prices for consumers. Even if tariffs eventually lead to more domestic manufacturing, which creates more jobs, which leads to higher wages, which offsets the higher prices, that's a long-term process. It takes years, maybe decades. In the short term, you pay more for everything, and the benefits haven't materialized yet, and there's no guarantee the benefits will materialize because manufacturing jobs that left the U.S. didn't just leave because of trade policy. They left because of automation, because of changes in technology, because of changes in the global economy. You can put up tariff walls, but that doesn't automatically bring those jobs back. Companies might just absorb the higher costs or find different suppliers or automate even more to reduce labor costs or 100 other things that don't involve bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. So the promise of tariffs creating jobs is uncertain, but the reality of tariffs increasing prices is guaranteed. Now, the administration argues that tariffs bring in revenue for the government, and that's true. When you impose a 10% tariff on imports and companies pay that tariff, that money goes to the U.S. Treasury. So tariffs can be a source of government revenue. But here's the thing, that revenue comes from consumers. When a company pays a tariff and then passes that cost along to consumers through higher prices, the consumer is ultimately paying the tariff. It's a tax on consumers that just happens to be collected through importers. So when the administration talks about tariff revenue, what they're really talking about is collecting more taxes from consumers through an indirect method. Now, if that revenue is used for something beneficial like tax cuts or infrastructure or deficit reduction or whatever, maybe it's worth it. But you have to understand that it's not free money. It's coming from somewhere. It's coming from higher prices. And then there's the retaliation issue. When the U.S. puts tariffs on another country, that country usually responds with tariffs on U.S. goods. So if we put a 10% tariff on Chinese imports, China responds with tariffs on U.S. agricultural products or U.S. automobiles or whatever. This hurts American companies that export to those countries. American farmers who sell soybeans to China suddenly can't compete because Chinese tariffs make their soybeans more expensive than soybeans from Brazil. American manufacturers who sell machinery to Europe suddenly face tariffs that make their products more expensive than European alternatives. So tariffs can hurt American businesses even as they're supposedly protecting American businesses. It depends on which businesses we're talking about. Some benefit, some get hurt. And overall, the economy becomes less efficient, prices go up, and everyone's a little bit worse off. This is why most economists are skeptical of tariffs as a broad economic policy. There are specific situations where targeted tariffs can make sense, but broad, sweeping tariffs tend to do more harm than good in most economists' view. So what can you do about all this? Unfortunately, not much when it comes to tariff policy itself. That's decided in Washington. But you can prepare for the likely reality of higher prices. First, if you're planning any major purchases, especially things that are likely to be affected by tariffs like electronics or appliances or furniture, you might want to make those purchases sooner rather than later before prices go up even more. Second, look at your budget and see where you can cut expenses or find cheaper alternatives. Maybe you switch from name brand to store brand at the grocery store. Maybe you cut back on eating out. Maybe you cancel subscriptions you're not really using. Third, if you have any flexibility in your income, now might be a good time to look for ways to increase it. A side job, freelance work, asking for a raise, whatever options are available to you. Fourth, pay attention to what's happening, stay informed, understand what policies are being implemented and how they might affect you. Don't just assume things will get better on their own. Be realistic about the economic environment we're in. And fifth, plan for the possibility that things might get worse before they get better. Have an emergency fund if possible. Avoid taking on new debt. Be conservative with your financial planning. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not making a political argument here about whether Trump's policies are good or bad overall. I'm not telling you who to support or oppose politically. I'm just laying out the facts about what's happening with tariffs and what that means for prices. You can support Trump and still acknowledge that tariffs increase prices. You can oppose Trump and still acknowledge that there might be some long-term benefits to his trade policies. My goal here is just to give you accurate information so you can make informed decisions about your own finances and your own life. But the political reality is that we're in an environment where trade policy is being used as a tool to achieve various goals, whether that's bringing back manufacturing jobs or putting pressure on other countries to support U.S. foreign policy objectives like the Greenland situation, or raising revenue or whatever. And the short-term consequence of that approach is higher prices for consumers. That's just the reality we're dealing with. Whether you think it's worth it in the long run is a political question, but the impact on your grocery bill in the next few months is an economic fact.